Hey Bio30s, it's Manchak here with your D3 and D4 video lesson. And last week, what I'd done with you is switched over to a new method where I had you just watching videos basically, and then moving into a video of me just going through the highlights of what was going on. After some comments from others, I've decided that that's probably not the best way and what you're most comfortable with. So instead of switching halfway through, I've gone back to back this week to what I've been doing before. And so that's what we're going to be covering and how we're going to be covering things today. So far in this unit, you should have covered last week's stuff, which is Hardy-Weinberg and changes in gene pools. What we're going to get into today is we're going to continue to talk about populations and communities and how populations change as time goes by. And instead of sort of focusing on the genetic stuff that we've focused on in the last concept, what we're going to really get into now is some real sort of population dynamics stuff. I love this stuff because if you guys remember, I've got a degree in conservation biology, and so these are the kinds of things that I would have used if I was a field researcher in that program, and it really hits home with me on how we track how healthy a population is and what are the things that we're looking at and where are the influences coming from and all of that kind of stuff. So concept D3 is what we're going to start with today, and that is describing and explaining factors that influence population growth. And we're going to boil it down to the very minimum, which is mortality, natality, immigration, and emigration. Then in D3, we'll move on to talk about how populations grow and how we can describe the way populations grow. So we're going to look at things like exponential growth and logistic growth when we get into D4, but we're going to really just look at some numbers today and talk about growth rate, per capita growth rate, population density, and how we describe densities and those kinds of things. So this stuff we're going to do a little bit more math, but really this is like no more complicated than what you might have done in science in grade 8. Okay, so this is nothing to worry about, but do have a calculator handy. When we get on to D4, that's where we're going to get into talking about growth curves and patterns and what sort of certain organisms exhibit as far as patterns go. And then we're going to move into talking about reproductive strategies as well, what we call R-selected and K-selected. Okay, then that leads us to our last two concepts next week. Can you believe that next week is our last set of lessons for the course? And so that leaves the very last week, and I'll talk about this, the very last week, the week of June 19th, which is the Friday, to get organized and caught up if we need to. Although my marks for your course, just so you are aware, need to be in by June 18th. And if you're watching this in a year that is subsequent, or you're not even part of my division or whatever, you can ignore all of that stuff. So here we go. That's what we're working on today. Just a couple of highlights then here for us. So I'm going to be talking about, I've sort of run through all of this. These are just my notes over here. You got your textbook pages. I've got two videos for you. One of them is relatively short on population dynamics, and then the other one is a bit longer. It's a crash course one. I found it quite amusing, actually. Might be worthwhile. It's about 12 minutes long, so something that you can handle if you want a little bit more background information on this kind of stuff. And then I've got a worksheet that you guys will work on. There's a bunch of textbook questions. If you'd like to do them, fantastic. They'll give you an idea of what's important. And if you don't want to do that, please definitely do worksheet number 2 and then check your answers with the key that's in the Google Classroom. Formative quiz, summative quiz, boom, you're done the concept. So I'm hoping to move through this stuff relatively quickly with you so that I don't take up too much of your time. So here we go. At one point, I'm going to actually have to hit pause and go and set up my system here to show you an example on my interesting document camera kind of thing that I've set up over the last little while. So we're going to start out with D3, which is characteristics of populations. So we've talked about populations already. We've talked about how, as time goes by, the gene pool changes in those populations, and a really large population that experiences all of those 5 characteristics Hardy Weinberg pointed out, it will stay stable, and the population should stay stable. Well, what we're going to get into now is sort of some of the nitty gritty of what ecologists do, and try to figure out when they're talking about the health of a population. So when they're talking about a health of a population, they're trying to figure out, is the population increasing? Is the population decreasing? Is it more or less staying the same? How rapidly is it increasing or decreasing? Those kinds of things are important for an ecologist who's studying a particular population. Remember, a population is organisms of the same species occupying a given area at a given time. And remember that those species must be able to interbreed with no, interesting side effects that might arise from that. So there's many factors that affect how a population grows. And population growth should be considered as both an increase or a decrease. So you can have positive population growth, which means the population is getting larger, or negative population growth, which means that the population is getting smaller, or you can have no population growth, which means that the population's size is remaining the same. The things that we're going to discuss today are these items. These are the things that are going to influence whether a population is experiencing positive or negative population growth. So mortality, natality, immigration, emigration, population density, carrying capacity, biotic potential, environmental resistance, and much more. So one tool scientists use to study population is examining the size of the population, the number of individuals of a given species occupying a given area or volume. And I say volume here because there are organisms that don't occupy the surface of the earth, right? They occupy the water or something along those lines. So at a given time. Okay, so population size then very easily is determined by counting the number of individuals in a population. And if the population sample area is large, then we tend to estimate, right? We're not going to go into, a forest inside of a provincial park and look at the population of spruce trees and count every last one of the spruce trees in that park, unless it's a park that doesn't have very many spruce trees. What we're going to do instead is we're going to do estimates of populations. So we'll take a representative area, so we think that it's relatively accurately representative of what the ecosystem looks like. We'll go and we'll sample that area, and then we'll extrapolate from there and say, okay, well, we sampled an area that is 10 meters by 10 meters, and we think that we've got 1,000 of these 10 meter by 10 meter plots, and so that's what we're going to examine. Okay, so that's sort of what we're talking about here. This estimation is going to be based on the number of individuals in a small chunk of that sample area in conjunction with population density measurements. And we're going to talk about density in a second here, because that factors in, that comes into play when we talk about population size. Another tool that we can use is along with population size, is something called population density, which I just mentioned. Population density is the same as when you think of what we did when we calculated maybe density back in grade 7 or grade 8. This is the same kind of idea, except in this case, we're talking about individuals in a given area or volume. So N in this case indicates number of individuals, and A in this case indicates area, or V, which is volume. So density of a population is number of individuals over the given area or volume that we're dealing with. So I think at this point it would be important to point out to you guys one thing, and I'll just pop it over onto the screen from my other screen here. Is this. So this is your data booklet, and you can have this out in front of you as you're working through this concept, and basically through the whole course if you wanted to. But a lot of the things that we are going to talk about today are contained on the first page of your data booklet here. And it's really a 3-pager. It's not really a booklet like the chemistry one might be. But for example, population density is listed up here, number of individuals, area, volume, time, change in carrying capacity, growth rate, per capita growth rate. All of these are symbols and descriptions that we might use in this. This is most of the stuff from Unit C, although you'll notice that this little bit down here with the P and the Q is from D1, which we covered. And then we've got some formulas down here. And I'll pop this back over in a second when we need to talk about it again. So the more individuals in a given area or volume, the greater the density. And so certain organisms like to have lots of density. Certain organisms don't like a lot of density because they aren't adapted to living in those kinds of environments. So, for example, a sample population of gophers living in one field in one summer is measured. Based on several samples, you find an average of 12 gophers living in an area of 10 square meters. What is the density? So all you're going to do, and I can write this out if you guys want, all you're going to do is you're going to take the number of gophers, so n is equal to 12, okay, and your area in this case is 10 meters squared. Okay, so then all you're going to do is take your density is number of moles. Your density is your number of individuals over the area, which is going to be 12 over 10, which is going to be 1.2 gophers, okay, per meter squared. I hope that makes sense. So there will be about 1.2 gophers for every meter square based on this population that we're studying. If we knew the field was 200 meters squared in size, all we would do is we'd take our density per meter squared and multiply it by the number of meters squared. So we'd end up with 1.2 times 200. It's early in the morning right now, and I'm not going to, it's about 240 individuals is what we'd end up with in that field. Pardon my really crappy mouse writing. So does that kind of make sense? That's how we calculate and work with density. It's really, really simple. We have to be careful with density calculations because they can be deceiving due to unusable space in an ecosystem. For example, with our gophers, there may be some parts of that 200 square meters that are unusable for them because they're treed or there's a wetland or something along those lines. So it doesn't describe their habitat. So they're not going to be able to use that for whatever reason. In situations where we're studying an area that is aquatic, okay, so we might be studying a pond or a stream or something like that, we're going to use a volume measurement of meters cubed or liters perhaps to describe what we're talking about rather than talking about square meters. Okay, so we'll use a different sort of measurement there. This discussion of density leads us to sort of this idea of dispersion. And this is going to be a key word for us, and I should have had this underlined for you. A key word for us in this concept. Dispersion of a population needs to be considered when calculating density. And population dispersion, okay, is the general pattern in which individuals are distributed through a specific area. And for us, we're going to cover three of them: uniform dispersion, random dispersion, and clumped dispersion. And we'll see that there are some that are more common than others. Here's just a simple graphical representation of what uniform, random, and clumped might be. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is the one we most often see in nature. And when you start to think about it, it kind of makes a little bit of sense because those individuals are clumping around some sort of a resource. Whether it's a resource for shelter or food or water or something along those lines, they're going to clump themselves around. Uniform distribution does happen, as does random distribution, and it really all depends on sort of what organism you are and how it works. But this one, especially for larger organism, often seems to be the case. So let's talk about random dispersion first. Random dispersion occurs when resources are abundant and there is little competition in a given area. So there's no identifiable pattern to how the organisms are distributed. It's relatively rare in nature. And I like to think of it as one of the ones that plants exhibit a lot because with the way they disperse, send out seeds, thinking of a dandelion, for example, it's random how the wind picks up the seed pods, and where those seed pods end up landing and germinating and turning into a dandelion. So that stuff is relatively random. Same with trees and other things that have sort of that distribution that is not entirely they don't have much choice as to where they end up, I guess would be the best way to put it. Then we get clumped distributions, and this occurs when members of a population are found in close proximity to each other, perhaps clumped around a food source or for safety, right? So those, a resource or maybe for safety reasons. This is the most common pattern we find in nature, and humans tend to exhibit a clumped distribution as well, right? We tend to have our cities in clumps. Around, when you think about history, right? Maybe it was around a fur trading post. Maybe it was around a resource of some sort that they needed access to, like a river, something along those lines. Distributions like fish, also, they clump together in schools as a way to defend themselves against predators, right? You minimize the chance of being eaten when you're part of a group. There's going to be something that's going to get eaten, but hopefully it's not you, kind of thing. And then lastly, uniform distribution occurs when individuals are evenly spaced over a defined area. And this does happen in a lot of areas. Like we create uniform distribution when we have an orchard and we plant an orchard, because we want our trees spaced evenly so that they have room to grow. They're not competing too much with each other for sunlight, anything like that, so we can maximize fruit growth. Other species of animals that require larger home ranges or tend to compete heavily with each other, like golden eagles, for example, they tend to disperse uniformly as well. So it happens when they're very territorial. I think another great example of this would be bears. And bears are very territorial. Grizzly bears with some of the largest home ranges that I can think of. In the hundreds of square kilometers, and they something gets in their territory and they find it, they chase it out, and that creates a bit of a uniform distribution over their habitat, if that makes sense. Okay, so we have to think of density and dispersion as playing roles, right? In the case of density, our density is going to be very high in a clumped distribution around the areas where the resource or the areas of safety are. In a uniform distribution, our density is going to be nicely spread out over there. So that consideration of the habitat is very important when we're discussing an organism in this area. So that's the beginning of this. If you guys wanted to go and look at these questions on 741, you could. I'm going to continue on to the next slide here, which is how we're going to start to measure and model population changes. So in Bio 20, we said there was a limit to the number of individuals an ecosystem can support. And we called that the ecosystem's carrying capacity, the maximum number of organisms that can be sustained by available resources in a given period of time. We coupled carrying capacity in Bio 20 with something called biotic potential, and I'm not going to dwell on this. If you wanted to go back and look at your notes or look back at your textbook and recall this, you can. Carrying capacity is coupled with biotic potential, and biotic potential is the maximum reproductive rate that could be achieved under ideal conditions. And it's regulated by 4 factors. Birthing potential, right? So how many organisms you can have in one birthing cycle. Capacity for survival, how many of those organisms actually survive after they've been born to reach sexual maturity. Breeding frequency, how often you're able to breathe, and that has to do with gestation period and other things like that. And then the length of reproductive life, how long are you going to be an active breeder for? Okay, so that factors into how a population grows, because if your biotic potential is very, very low, a population does not reestablish itself very quickly because you're having fewer individuals per birthing cycle. Maybe those individuals don't survive very well. You're not breeding very often. You're not having a long reproductive life. So that pushes down population growth. The other thing we're going to find is when we get up to carrying capacity, when that ecosystem is at or that population is at its maximum for that given ecosystem, we're going to find that the carrying capacity and biotic potential work to sort of keep things relatively even, that dynamic equilibrium we've talked about in the past. So there's 4 processes then that are going to lead to the change in the size of the population, and we have to look at these collectively. If we're going to describe the change in population, we got to look at all 4 of these things in order to understand how a population is going to change. So the first thing we have to look at is natality, which is number of births. Okay, if we got lots of births going on, there is probably a good chance that our population is going to be rising. But how is our mortality? Do we have equal births and deaths? Does that mean then that our population isn't changing? But we also have to consider immigration and emigration. Immigration is the movements of individuals into the population. Immigration starts with an I. So that's why I remember I starts with, or in starts with an I, so we end up with in. And then emigration, the movement of individuals out of a population. Okay, all 4 of these things need to be factored together, and the way we're going to factor them together is by looking at them as things that increase the population minus things that decrease the population. And that, if you've had a close look at that, that is how we represent change in population size in your data booklet. Factors that increase the population, which is immigration and natality, and then factors that decrease the population, which is emigration and mortality. Okay, so that's where that's coming from. So natality plus immigration minus mortality plus emigration is going to give you your change in, that's the delta symbol there, the number of individuals in your population. Immigration and emigration often occur in very low or equal amounts, so they don't tend to factor in as much as we might think, but it depends on every scenario is a little bit different, and populations can be a little tricky to study because of this. So I'm gonna do a bunch of stuff, and then we're gonna do an example right at the end here. So one thing that we can talk about to represent how a population changes is just the change in population, looking at those 4 factors and determining, is the population experiencing positive population growth or negative population growth. Then closely linked to that is the idea of growth rate. How much is the population changing as time goes by, right? Once you hear the word rate, you need to be factoring in time somehow. And so there's our time right there. So it is the change in population over a given amount of time gives us a growth rate. Just like speed is the change in distance in a given amount of time, growth rate is the change in population in a given amount of time. And this is another factor that an ecologist might look at to decide how healthy a population is, right? If the population is declining or increasing, if it's declining very, very slowly, that's of less concern than a population that is decreasing very rapidly. If a population is increasing very, very, very slowly, maybe we're watching that population to try to help it recover from some sort of stress that we've applied to it, and we're watching it and it's gradually increasing but not very much, that might be of concern for an ecologist. Okay, so growth rate is important to look at, same as population change. And then the other one that's associated with this, if we're trying to compare 2 populations, maybe one in one area and one in another area, and we're trying to link them to each other, per capita growth rate is what gives us the opportunity to make those comparisons. Okay, I always like to talk about this when we compare maybe Canada and the United States. We're both big countries in North America. We share a border, but the United States has a population that is more or less 10 times the size of our population. And so if we ever want to compare something, we have to compare it per capita, right? Per number of individuals in that country, or per person, if you want to look at it that way, because they have 330 million people in the United States, and I'm just throwing that number out, might be a little bit off. If we just looked at number of I don't know, PlayStation 4s that the population has, of course they're going to have more PlayStation 4s than Canada does because they have 10 times the population. But if we looked at the not a growth rate but a per capita amount of PlayStations, in other words, if we took into account how many people are in Canada versus how many people are in the United States, that allows us to compare apples to apples at that point. And we might find out that Canada has 0.5 PlayStation 4s per person, and the United States only has 0.4. So even though we have fewer PlayStation 4s in Canada, there are more per person in Canada. I hope that made sense to you. When we're dealing with population growth, sometimes we want to compare two populations to each other. So we would do a per capita growth rate for each of those populations. So we would look at the change in population and we would divide it by the number of individuals. And then that would give us a per capita growth rate for that population. And so it allows us to compare populations of different sizes and sort of here's an example of how you could do it. Maybe you've got a population that's really been struggling, and we've been working hard on that population to make sure that it's growing and recovering. And we're going to compare it to the growth rate of a population that is doing really well in a really healthy ecosystem. And so we're going to compare those two by looking at per capita growth rates. And if we find that this one over here is struggling for some reason, we may have to go back to the drawing board and say, well, it's not growing as rapidly as it could. So what are the pieces of its habitat or its ecosystem that need help in order to allow that population to recover? I hope that kind of makes sense to you guys. So the next thing that we're going to move on to then is, I believe we're gearing up to an example here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit pause, and it's going to mean absolutely nothing to you because it'll be back instantaneously, and we will work through this example here. Okay, and I'm back here with my little system set up. So we're going to work through a bunch of different examples here of how this works and what's going on, and it'll be relatively straightforward, I hope, for you to sort out how this is going. All right, so here's our scenario. Over 2 years, okay, I'm going to kind of underline the things that I think are important here. A population of 900 experienced 66 deaths, okay, 66 births, 14 deaths, 5 individuals left the population, 13 individuals joined the population. So we've been given a bunch of information, and now we're asked to figure out what is the population change, the change in the number of individuals in the population, what is the new population size, what is the growth rate, what is the per capita growth rate. And the per capita growth rate is kind of dumb to calculate on this one because we're not really comparing it to anything else. But we might do that in some of the examples in worksheet 2 if we get to that. So let's start out with A, the population change. And we know change in population is the things that add to the population or increase the population, which is natality, births, and immigration. And we're going to subtract away the things that take away from the population, which is going to be mortality and emigration. Okay, so we're gonna treat those together. We're gonna do some simple math and we're gonna solve it. Hopefully, I'm gonna have enough room to work all of this stuff for you on this one piece of paper. So we're gonna do natalities, 66 births. Okay, plus we're gonna say individuals, 13 joined the population, which is 13, minus we had 14 deaths, and we had an immigration of 5 individuals. So I'm telling you right now, I can look at this and say this population is increasing. So this is 79 minus 19, which is going to give us 60. And I'm going to put a plus in there. So plus 60 individuals for the population is our population growth. Okay, what is our new population size after these 2 years? Well, we started out with 900 individuals. We experienced a population growth of 60 individuals. So our new population size is 960 individuals. Okay, that should make sense, I hope, to you, where that came from. So that's B. Let's move on to C, and I'm going to slide this over just a touch. Okay, so C says, what is the growth rate? Okay, growth rate is GR. Don't forget, if you forget these things, don't forget if you forget, you can bring over you can open up your data booklet here, and you're going to find things like growth rate and per capita growth rate in there for you. So you don't have to remember that off the top of your head. Growth rate is your change in population over your given amount of time, which for us, remember, is 2 years. Okay, so it's going to be 60 individuals, okay, over 2 years, so positive 60 individuals over 2 years. So our growth rate is a positive 30 individuals per year. Okay, hope that makes sense. Like I said, this is super simple math. It should be relatively easy for you guys to think about and sort of understand where all of this is coming from. The last thing, which I said is kind of silly, and I'm not sure why I kept it in here, but I did, is what is the per capita growth rate? So what are we increasing per individual in that time? And so per capita growth rate, CGR, is your change in population over the number of individuals in your population. And so our change in population, we said, is plus 60 individuals. Okay, and we're going to divide that by the number of individuals in the population, which we're going to use 900. So our per capita growth rate, this is the one I probably should be able to do in my head, but I can't, is 0.06, let's say 7 for our per capita growth rate. Okay, hope that makes sense to you guys. I hope that works for you. It's relatively simple stuff to work out, and so worksheet number 2 has some of these questions in it, and we'll get you guys doing some of those questions as we work our way through it. I did go through that relatively quickly, so if you need to, by all means, go back and watch this again. Maybe as you're doing the worksheet or something along those lines, just because I did, like I said, move relatively quickly through this. So I'm going to just make this disappear over here and disconnect that, and then we'll go on to the next bit. So that is concept D3, if I'm not mistaken. What I'm going to do right now is, if you guys want to move into and get started on worksheet 2, you could do the first few questions on there. Remember, for D3 and D4, we're only doing questions 1 through 6. So you could work through a couple of the population growth kinds of questions and move on. What I am going to do now is I'm going to move on to doing the next part of this, which is talking about population growth models and how all of those things work. Try to wrap this up as quickly as I can. So, population growth models. The growth of a population also depends on whether the population is open or closed. An open population means that its borders are open and individuals are allowed to move into the population and exit the population as necessary. So, an open population depends on natality, mortality, immigration, and emigration. And our wild populations are open. The only thing that I would say is that not every wild population is open. There are some wild populations that we could kind of consider to be closed. Maybe the wild population of bison at Elk Island National Park might be considered a closed population because natural immigration and emigration doesn't occur. However, human immigration and emigration is occurring because we are taking individuals of that bison population and moving them somewhere else. So there is emigration taking place. I'm not sure if there's immigration taking place. I haven't studied it quite that much. So really all that's affecting that population, then we would consider it to kind of be closed at that point. Really, it's only depending on natality and mortality, births and deaths, to regulate the population. However, we are letting individuals leave as well. And if you haven't taken my outdoor ed class, you may not have studied along with me the bison population in Alberta and how Elk Island does an amazing job with that. But if that's something that interests you, track me down and I can share some information with you. It's a really cool experience to learn a little bit about what they're doing. Anyway, I digress. A good example might be also an isolated island. An island way out in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, for whatever organism. Maybe it's a land-based organism, right? Like a, I don't know, a ferret. I don't know why I came up with ferret, but that's what I came up with. And that if there's a population of ferrets on that island in the middle of an ocean, there's really not much of a chance that ferrets are going to go and swim from that island to the mainland or vice versa, right? So immigration and emigration are basically shut off at that point. Again, this is relatively rare in nature. The next thing, so let's talk about how we can describe how a population is growing. And we're going to use this term, two terms, exponential or logistic growth. So exponential growth is a population size that is increasing by a fixed rate over a fixed period of time, and it's usually denoted by the variable r. And r is limited only by the biotic potentials of the organisms in the population. Remember, biotic potential is things like how many offspring per round of breeding, how frequently do they breed, all of those kinds of factors. So exponential growth is really interesting. A population will show exponential growth only when there are unlimited resources, with the only limiting factor being biotic potential. So technically speaking, exponential growth doesn't occur very often in nature because resources are always limited in nature. However, in a lab situation, we could have exponential growth of something. As long as we continue feeding that something its resources, then it can experience exponential growth. That's why we work often with bacteria to study things like genetics, is because we can get them to grow exponentially by just making sure we feed them on a regular basis and provide all of the resources they need. That means that population can just shoot right up and we can get billions of individuals in a relatively short period of time, which I think is pretty fascinating. Exponential growth has also been talked about really interestingly in this COVID pandemic, and how the growth of and we're not talking about individuals necessarily, but the virus itself has spread through the population, and the number of cases has grown exponentially to start with. But what we're seeing is actually more of a logistic growth, and then actually coming back down. We've sort of flattened the curve, and then our population. It's really kind of cool to look at. And there are some population growth models that you can sort of look at to make this make sense for you. So this is what I'm going to move myself over here. This is what a population growth model that is experiencing exponential growth might look like. This is yeast cells. The numbers over here are in the thousands, and this is the time in days. And so this is what we would call a J-shaped curve. It kind of looks a little bit like a J, if you can imagine it. And the populations tends to have much higher natality than mortality at this point. And it's growing basically unchecked as time goes by. Populations of larger organisms are measured once a year, so seasonal fluctuations aren't seen. So if we were doing this in a lab situation, we would probably see something like this, and instead of measuring in days, we measure in days in this case. If we're looking at something bigger, a larger organism, we might measure it in years rather than days, because there are seasonal fluctuations that we experience. Exponential growth must end at some point. Why do you think that is? Well, because supplies are limited. Okay, and so we're going to end up with a situation where they're going to run out of resources to continue to grow exponentially. So this is what logistic growth is all about. So it occurs in natural conditions, unlike exponential growth. And logistic growth is a model of population growth describing growth that levels off when we hit carrying capacity. And that is the key bit. So we're bringing carrying capacity back into here. Remember, carrying capacity is the number of individuals of a population that an ecosystem can support. And so once we get to that level, the population always levels off at that point. So there's 3 stages in logistic growth. There's a lag stage, a log stage, and a stationary stage. And we'll talk about what those are. The lag stage is where we get very slow growth to start with. And then maybe there's a critical number of individuals of that population met. We start to experience what we call the log stage, where we experience some exponential growth. But due to lack of resources, that exponential growth tails off into a stationary phase. And that occurs close to or at the carrying capacity for that ecosystem. So this is what a logistic population growth might look like. I'm just going to switch back to my pointer. Please get my pointer. Oh, I see what the problem is. Being outsmarted by the technology. And you guys just get to listen to it. Isn't that fun? So the size of the population is when it has reached the carrying capacity. So we have a lag phase here. We've got a bit of a log phase where it's growing exponentially for a given amount of time. And then it starts to level off into a stationary phase. That stationary phase is K, which is our carrying capacity. Okay. And at the stationary phase, the population is at dynamic equilibrium. Remembering that it's not going to stay perfectly static on a perfectly straight line. The population is going to do one of these things. It's going to go up and down, up and down, up and down as years pass, but it's going to go up and down, up and down, up and down around that carrying capacity. So we can draw the carrying capacity as a nice straight line, but often the line for our population size is a little bit up and down around that carrying capacity. All right, that's that section. I hope that makes sense to you. Exponential versus logistic growth, and R versus K. Okay, R-shaped, or that R curve, which is our exponential curve, versus our, oh, and I didn't describe that, J versus S. I should pop back and just say that. This is an S-shaped curve, and it's a really sort of stretched out S, but you guys can sort of see that S-shaped curve there, okay? Let's just wrap things up here. So factors affecting population change. We're going to talk just a little bit more about this stuff and go a little tiny bit deeper into this. So we've talked about what leads to population change. We talked about how we can quantify that by looking at things like density, natality, mortality, emigration, growth rate, per capita growth rate, all of that kind of stuff. Then we got into talking about how populations grow and the sizes of population, or the shapes of the curves of population, exponential versus S curves or logistic curves. Now we're going to get into talking about just a couple other things. We can determine population changes based on factors like mortality or immigration, but what limits the population's ability to change its size? I'm going to have a sip of my tea. Well, there's factors that do this, and these terms that we're going to discuss here, I think, are very important to think about, because they're kind of things that a population are subjected to that it may or may not have control over in some ways. So density dependent factors. Density, there's that word density coming back, dependent. So these are factors that influence the size of a population only when it has a particular density. So these factors are linked to the struggle for survival. Okay, and I think I'm going to just quickly highlight that for you. So they're linked to the struggle for survival. The struggle for survival includes things like competition, which is a huge one. If you do any sort of studying of ecology after this, you'll talk a lot about competition. Predation, disease, and other biological effects. Okay, so all of these factors become more prevalent when the density of a population increases. And once a density hits a critical point, populations will naturally decrease in order to compensate for that. Okay, so what we're describing is populations will grow. They'll do that sort of exponential growth when the density is low enough. But when the density gets high enough, when there's enough of a population around, the competition starts to increase, the predation starts to increase, the disease has a greater effect. And so what ends up happening is the populations will naturally start to decrease and that's where we start to get that leveling off and hitting that carrying capacity of that population. Again, this whole COVID thing has me thinking about density dependent factors, and the fact that we've been asked and told to physically distance ourselves from people. And the reason why we're doing that is trying to spread out the density. Because when we get a dense population all together in a spot and one person is infected by COVID, it can spread through that population very, very quickly because of the density, how closely packed we are. That's why we've done all of this physical distancing stuff, because it limits the growth or the transmission of that disease. And it makes logical sense. Even when we're sitting here discussing populations, it still makes sense, right? Because we're limiting the density. We're trying to spread us out and be less dense. All right, so these factors lead to what we call intra-specific competition. Really important term for us here. Intra, please remember that prefix means within. So we're talking about the competition within a particular population. So intra-specific competition are ecological interactions in which individuals of the same species, there's the intra, compete for resources in their habitat. More density equals more intra-specific competition. That would be us competing for toilet paper. All right. Density independent factors are factors that have the same influence on a population no matter its density. And so these are things that are quote unquote acts of God. So these might be things like temperature. The organisms don't, there's nothing that the density of the population isn't going to really have an effect on temperature. So temperature will affect it though. Pesticides, fire, floods, drought, all of these are examples of density independent factors, things that don't care whether the population is really tightly packed into that given habitat or whether they're nice and evenly spread out, or whether there's lots of them in a small area or just a few of them in that area. They don't care. Fire's going to roll through, flood's going to roll through, pesticides are going to do their things. Okay, so regardless of the population's density, these factors will work to reduce the population size. Once the factor disappears, then the population will hopefully increase in size once more, as long as there's individuals around to allow that to happen. Almost done. Limiting factors in population size. Another factor that affects population size is scarcity. And this is another one of those terms that if you do any ecology following Bio 30, you'll talk a lot about scarcity. And it's what we mean. What we mean is that the resource in shortest or smallest supply, okay, is the factor that limits population growth. Okay, so best example I can give you this is to consider nitrogen and carbon dioxide and sunlight. All plants need these things in order to grow. Thus, to increase population size, they need ample amounts of these. However, if the nitrogen supply is severely restricted, okay, and there's ample sunlight and carbon dioxide, then the thing that is most scarce, okay, the highest scarcity, most scarce in the population or in the ecosystem is the nitrogen. That is what is going to limit the population growth, is the nitrogen supply. If for some reason we start to fertilize those plants, give them lots and lots and lots of nitrogen, and sunlight becomes scarce, that is the limiting factor at that point. Okay, so and I'll say this again, the resource that is in the smallest or shortest supply is what limits population growth. Okay, a stable ecosystem encourages population growth. An ecosystem in turmoil or under stress is going to hinder population growth. A stable ecosystem would be one in which the abiotic and biotic factors remain similar year after year, so that we can easily predict what's going on. If we think deeper about this, we might notice that two assertions aren't entirely true. Stability is population dependent. In other words, certain conditions favor certain populations while excluding others. However, a changing ecosystem may be beneficial for new organisms, but hinder those organisms that like the stability of the ecosystem before it started changing. And when I did some of my studies in conservation biology, and you guys know that I studied a lot about birds, we would often talk about specific kinds of birds that did really well with living at the edges of an ecosystem, right, in the ecotones. Um, and they would often push out other organisms that liked the stability. And as we add edges to ecosystems, as we go through and change the way an ecosystem looks by altering the landscape, whether that's putting a new road through, putting a well site in, whatever it might be, that changes that ecosystem and that allows for access to other organisms to come in that like to live in those areas of change. And it pushes out those organisms that don't like to live in those areas of change. So it's really interesting to start to think about the effects that might have on a population. So we're going to circle back here to K and R again, which we talked about in the last just a few minutes ago. So K is the number of individuals, that's carrying capacity, right? The number of individuals in a population at the carrying capacity of its ecosystem. So what we're going to talk about now are how we can describe certain kinds of organisms and how we would find them, those populations in a particular ecosystem, and how they might respond to that ecosystem. So a K-selected organism is an organism that has a trait that allows them to adapt to living in a population at or near carrying capacity. And so we usually find these organisms in a stable environment. They produce only few offspring and devote lots of time to them. They're large organisms, often with long lifespans. The offspring are slow growing. They are low biotic potential, and their numbers change slowly. So humans are a good example of that. Bears, elk, other large organisms would factor into that. Why am I telling you about this? Well, if I'm an ecologist and I'm trying to study, let's say, bears, for example, and trying to figure out how to help them recover, I need to understand that they are a K-selected organism that is adapted to living at carrying capacity, and they do best when they're at that. And when an ecosystem is under stress, we're going to have to sort of help them through that particular scenario in order for them to survive better. It also gives me a better idea of what I'm observing in a given ecosystem if I'm watching an ecosystem. Some populations may shoot right up because they're better adapted to living not at carrying capacity, whereas other ones really like that stability as time goes by, the K-selected organisms. We contrast K-selected with R-selected. R, remember, is the increase of a population experiencing exponential growth. And an R-selected organism is adapted to increase its population size very quickly. So some traits of these organisms are found in unstable environments. Okay, so in other words, they're able to take advantage of a rapidly changing set of resources and conditions. They produce many offspring, devoting very little time and attention to them. They tend to be small in size. They have a short lifespan. They have a high biotic potential. They grow quickly. Okay, so really we're talking about insects, other arthropods, bacteria, organisms that can exploit the right conditions very, very quickly and then move on to their next stage of their life, whatever it might be. So they don't need to have that stability. I mean, if the stability was there, great, they would continue to grow exponentially. If the stability is not there, then they're just going to continue on their lives. And sort of, so I'm thinking about this time of year, particular insect species. I saw a post on Twitter the other day about the mayflies coming out in a particular area in Alberta here, and that's an idea of an R-selected organism. Is they, at least at that part of their life cycle, is they lay their eggs. Well, we'll start out. They hatch as adults out of the water, and you're going to get hundreds of thousands of them coming up in an area at a time. They're going to get into these big mating swarms where the males and females mix together, and then it's a mating swarm. The females are not impregnated, but the eggs are fertilized for them, and then the females go and lay their eggs, and they die right after that, and the males mate and they die right after that. So we get this massive population growth that comes up, and then basically all of those adult stage mayflies die very, very quickly. And then they enter a more of a stable sort of stage in the water as those eggs develop into larvae. Those larvae develop into pupae. Those pupae eventually come up to the top, and then we get back to that, massive growth, or we see that exponential growth of the adult mayfly population increasing and then crashing again. That would be an example of what we would see with R selected kind of stuff, even though that's just a stage of a life cycle. Anyway, to have me thinking about that. This table here just gives you some information about the difference between being K-selected and R-selected. I would suggest you have a look at it, because I will ask a question about, describe an organism that is K-selected versus an organism that is R-selected, or something along those lines. And I'd like you to tell me a few of these things on here and why you chose, humans to be a K-selected species versus, I don't know, the E. coli to be an R-selected species, something along those lines. All right, so that is it, ladies and gentlemen, for concepts D3 and D4. That was probably a relatively long video. I have no idea how long it is because I don't have a little timer on here. However, just to remind you then that we have 2 videos that I'd like you guys to look at if you have the chance, that sort of walk you through some of this, maybe a little bit more in depth in some cases, but really, really good videos. And then please make sure, if you do anything, tackle questions 1 through 6 on worksheet number 2. To make sure you've got this down. Once you feel confident with it, please move on to the practice quiz, the formative practice quiz. Wait for my feedback before you jump into the summative quiz. And I believe that's all I have to say about D3 and D4. Remember, 1 more week after this, and then I've covered all of Biology 30 with you, and you are done the course if you've been staying caught up. So that's all I have to say for now. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll talk soon.